What's up, everybody, and welcome to Horseshoe Bend, just outside of Page, Arizona. I've been here for a couple hours already. The sunset is beautiful behind me. I've been shooting a special exclusive tutorial for Fujifilm using their new GFX 50S camera and 23mm GF lens, which is actually in full frame speak an 18mm equivalent. So the sunset, I am really impressed with it, and I'm going to show you guys what I was able to capture with the Fujifilm GFX and how the sky just exploded in red color. It looks insane. But actually, for the lesson tonight, what I want to cover, I had this idea, since this is already a really wide landscape and everything's clearing up, these clouds in a couple hours are going to clear up. Originally, my idea was to go ahead and shoot star trails over this location. This location faces right into the sun, so I know that's generally the west area there, and I'm on the celestial equator, so the stars are going to streak right across the sky. It has the potential of being very beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with my Fujifilm GFX. Again, that's an 18mm equivalent. We already learned that that's a 4:3 format, so I'm basically going to align a composition, and I'm going to shoot the normal procedure for star trails with this. I'm going to shoot everything until the end of sunset, into the blue hour at f8, even if I have to use 30 or 60 seconds like I usually do, create a control layer, and then once it shifts into full dark, I'm going to get into star trail mode, which you guys remember I always use 30 seconds, and depending on how dark it gets, I'm not sure how dark it's going to get, that will determine the settings I use, whether that's going to be f1600 at f4 on that lens, 800, 400, or whichever. We'll figure that out as we get further into the night. In Photographing the World 3, I used a tilt shift lens while we were in New York on top of the rock to avoid lens distortion on the buildings. Here in Horseshoe Bend, my idea is to use the exact same lens to shift down in order to capture the lowest part of the landscape. Let's take a look at one of the reference frames that I took when I thought of capturing the scene this way. As I shifted down, take a look at how much of Horseshoe Bend I actually get. Now look at the center horizon. When I center this lens at 19mm, take a look at how much I get. I don't get anywhere near as much when I shift down. So just the idea of creating a shift pano using this, capturing the bottom, the middle, and the top already occurred to me, and I thought that would look beautiful. But you know what? We're really far in the Photographing the World series right now. We've done a lot of stuff together all over the world, so I'm going to take it to the next level, and we are going to create a panoramic image using the shift function in this tilt shift lens. We're going to take it one step further, and instead of just capturing the sunset, I'm also going to capture star trails. So it's going to be really interesting. I'm going to take a series of shots, shift it down, and then finally shift it up at the sky to capture the stars, and then we're going to put it all together in post-processing. I was looking at the star charts and I was using photo pills, and this is going to be really interesting because right now the moon is going to rise from the east, actually directly behind me. So around 9 or 10 o'clock, it's not a full moon. It's about 5 or 6 days from full, so it's still near full. It's going to rise behind me, and I think it's going to start painting the landscape in light. And it's also going to cause something else. It's going to start washing out the sky. It's going to wash out the stars of the sky, but thankfully it's behind me. But I have a feeling that I'm actually going to end up with moonlight and moon shadows in this frame. So right now, I'm not sure if this is going to be a blessing or a curse. In the end, if I end up having light on the landscape itself, it could be really cool because that light could help me blend all of those exposures together. And you guys know from watching everything that we've done so far, I like to use a control image, a blue hour shot at the lowest ISO possible, and then blend that with the stars because I've had to crank the ISO itself. So I have a feeling that if I have light on the top of the mountains, I'm not just going to end up with a black line in the starry sky. I may have a nice blending point in post-processing. Again, this is all speculation. I have not been using tilt-shift lenses for long. We had a great result with it in New York City, and I've never tried astrophotography using one, let alone a panoramic astrophotography star trail image. So again, there is some potential for failure, but I'm going to do whatever I can to be able to put this together later in post-processing. So just like last time, I'm going to pop the camera into video mode. Now this is 16:9 again, so it's going to be much wider than the normal 3:2 that I'm working with. Right now I have my horizon leveled. I know that because the indicator on the back of my camera is showing green across the board. Now this is a centered horizon, and then this is also a centered shift on the lens itself. So first, let me go ahead and shift down and show you how much of the scene I can actually capture. As I shift down, I can keep shifting. Even in 16:9, you can see how incredible that is. I can almost get to the bottom of the river. Now that's the extent of down. So the idea is the first thing I'm going to do is capture a control image at blue hour in this position. After I do that, I'm going to go ahead and shift it back up to the horizon. Takes a while. This is actually a rotary knob, so it doesn't slide on you. Shift it back up to the horizon, right about a level horizon here, and I'm going to take another control image. The idea behind that is I'm going to be able to take these two images at blue hour, put them together, and create a seamless image of Horseshoe Bend. Then, as it gets later at night, I'm going to move up, and watch how far I can actually move up here to capture the stars. Well, right now, that sunset still looks pretty good. And those clouds, just like I thought, are going to be moving out. So once it gets dark, this is going to be the position that I'm going to be able to capture the star trails. Then in post, we're going to do a little bit of magic as usual, and we're going to put all that together. Now remember, this is the D810, so it's 36 megapixels, and I am potentially putting together 3 frames. So this is going to be a massive file when we put it all together. Not to mention, I'm going to have countless star images that I'm going to have to stack. So this file size is going to be off the charts, but I'm hoping the end result is going to be something totally unique because of the stars and the landscape. Not to mention, this is the first time we've ever done a vertical panorama in photographing the world. So the first step, before the light all starts to fade, I'm going to go ahead and shift all the way down, and I'm going to take my last control frame. Again, this is a tedious process, especially when you're in a hurry, having to twist this a bunch of times. So, okay, let me go ahead and take my shot right now. All right, let's review this shot together. So if we take a look, I've shifted all the way down, and if I check my settings here, just to give you guys the settings, you can see I see in the entirety of Horseshoe Bend. I've even picked up some of the rocks in the bottom, which isn't a problem. The beautiful green moss is still intact. This was a manual exposure, and actually I had it set on ISO 64, which is even better, at f8 at an 8-second exposure. So that looks great. I'm really happy with it. Now I'm going to shift back up to capture the middle of the horizon, my other frame that I'm going to need to stitch. So I'm going to go through the tedious process here of twisting. And again, when I'm twisting, I'm being really careful to not bump my camera. And I like this, actually. This twist style is pretty good because it prevents me from sliding this. This won't sag over time. So here we go. That one's set right in the center. Let me go ahead and check the settings here. Everything looks good. Let me go ahead and shoot this one too. All right, let's review this shot now. This shot is exposed exactly the same, 8 seconds, ISO 64, f8 manual, because I wanted to match Horseshoe Bend itself. Don't worry that the sky's blown out. That's because I had to overexpose to compensate for the very dark foreground. And by doing so, I've overexposed the sky as well. But that doesn't matter because in a few minutes, that sun's going to get further and further and further below the atmosphere. And we're actually going to be able to get those stars and that dark sky. So this looks pretty good. I like that. I may shoot a couple more as we get into a darker sky. And once it starts to get dark, it's going to be time to shift up. And once I shift up, we're going to be focusing on capturing the stars themselves. In my opinion, the foreground looks awesome. I love the bottom. I love the middle. I think it's going to stitch together perfectly. As you can see, though, the sky was totally blown out. So we have a little bit of time to kill. Now, it's always tricky. Remember, when you're shooting into the sun, that sun has to set probably for an hour this time of year. We're in March before I can start to see the stars. So I have a little bit of time to kill, maybe 45 minutes to an hour and a half. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And as soon as it's dark enough to see the stars and start capturing them and changing the settings in the camera, I'm going to check back with you guys. And then we're going to be capturing what's going to become the top of this vertical panoramic image. As you guys can probably tell, it's full dark outside because I have another panel light. You know how much I love panel lights glaring in the face here when we're shooting this, but it's the only way that we can illuminate me and we can do this tutorial. So basically, right now the sky is looking really good. I think it's almost time to capture the stars. Now throughout this whole time, I've been waiting for that sun to go far enough down on the horizon that I can actually see the sky. Beautiful stars behind me because there is no light. That moon's still a few hours from rising, but over this direction, there was a strip of sun on the horizon for quite some time. So I've been shooting through through it, hoping that I can get the star sequence started as soon as possible. But take a look at a couple of these frames I've been capturing over the last 20 minutes. This one was shot at a 30-second exposure, f4 at ISO 400. Again, this lens only goes to f4, it doesn't go down to f2.8. But take a look at that horizon. Now, I'm shifting the horizon right in the center here. I haven't moved up for the stars because that sun's still intense. So I had to wait a little bit longer. And as I started to wait, let's take a look at the next frame that I captured. Now this one, you can see that strip has gone down on the horizon, that sun. So I waited a little bit longer. And as I started moving forward in time, let's take a look at the next frame. In this frame, you can see that that strip of the sun is almost gone, but that flare is starting to happen. So I waited a little bit longer until that sun disappeared and I shifted the camera up. As you can see, stars look great, but there's this weird glow on the horizon. I'm not really sure what that is. The settings I'm going to use are a little bit different. I'm going to use a 30-second exposure, 1600 ISO, and I want a cool sky, and since I'm getting ready to shoot stars, I want to make sure that I shoot a consistent white balance. Doesn't mean I can't change it later. I'm going to go ahead and pick 3030 Kelvin so it stays consistent. I'm going to go ahead and take this shot right now. Now, it's interesting. You can see that the horizon is very low. I've shifted the camera up very high, but I still have this spike of light on the horizon. So again, I'm not really sure if there's somebody with a camp back there or there's something going on. I was actually just talking to a local photographer a few minutes ago, and he was telling me that he's never seen that light before, and he believes that there is no town back there. So it could be some interesting anomaly, something that's there right now. I mean, who knows? The circus could be in town. But I want to wait a little bit longer and see if that light disappears. Because of that light in the sky, I've been waiting. It's been about 20 minutes now, and I've been taking a series of exposures, and in the process, something really interesting has happened. Let me go ahead and take a reference frame right now so I can show you guys. Now, I had to change the settings, but the new settings are f4, 30-second exposure, and an ISO of 400. Now, that may seem very strange that I've actually gone later in time, changed my ISO from 1600 down to 400, but let me go ahead and take a reference shot and show you exactly why I chose to do that. Now, this is so interesting to me because you can see that before, when I just had a black horizon line, when those mountains were just black, the moon has actually risen behind me and it's starting to paint that landscape with light. Now, what's really interesting is that spike of light, it never disappeared. But since the moon came up, it's casting light on the environment itself, but it's also illuminating the sky. Typically, having moonlight in your scene will wash out the sky and cause a negative effect on your astrophotography in general. But in this case, it was a blessing in disguise. Now, while it has washed out a little bit of the sky, it's also evened out that light disturbance so that I get a perfect strip of light on the horizon. So in this case, I don't see as many stars as I did before, but you know what? The camera picks up a lot more light, and I believe that now that that is an evenly lit horizon, that the stars are going to stack perfectly. So since everything's locked down, that moon is rising, everything looks even, it's staying consistent at ISO 400. What I've actually gone and done is this is using the tilt shift lens, the D810, and that shifted up. But since I never moved the Fujifilm camera through the sunset, I'm also locking down those settings as well. So throughout this process, I've also captured a clean frame for the blue hour here, but I haven't moved it. It's not a tilt shift lens. So I've actually mirrored the settings here, and the next step is to start capturing a series of 30-second exposures. So just after we get done wrapping this up, I'm actually going to just press these buttons and lock it. Now on my Nikon here, I have a $3 generic cable release. They're really easy. Same thing here on the GFX 50S. It's a generic release. Doesn't really matter if it's the fancy one or the $3 one. You just have to be able to lock it down. So this is set 30-second exposures, f4, ISO 400. This has the exact same settings. The next step, what I'm going to do is lock these shutters down and shoot through the night. I'm going to capture as many 30-second exposures as possible. And the target here is somewhere between 100 to 300 images. A good rule of thumb, when you're shooting from east to west, the celestial meridian, the stars actually move much faster than the center from the north to the south. If you look at a center of rotation for star trails, the very center, the North Pole and the South Pole, barely rotate over the course of a couple hours, but here they will streak through the sky. So I know that 100 frames, 30-second exposures at approximately 18 and 19 millimeter here is going to give me a really good and long star trail. I know that 300 will likely fill nearly the entire frame. So at this point, it's just going to come down to mental endurance, how long I want to sit out here, and if I start hearing coyotes, I may pack it up early. But for right now, let's go ahead and lock these down. So I'm going to go ahead and lock this one down here, just like that. And I'm going to lock this one down. Now what I also like to do when I lock down these cameras, I'm going to use my iPhone, and all smartphones have this feature. On the iPhone, it's just in the timer mode. I'm going to set a stopwatch. And my stopwatch now is set to 0. I'm going to go ahead and click start. So I know I've actually done the calculations. I know that I need 330-second exposures. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and try to stay out here about 2.5 to 3 hours to be able to capture everything that I need. We've been out here for a while. It started to get a little cold and windy. I think, based on my calculations, I've managed to capture somewhere around 260 to 280 30-second exposures for the stars. It was great. This part of the sky stayed crystal clear. Over there on the horizon, there were some mixed clouds, but nothing interfered with my shot. I think I have, with all of the shots that I captured, each one is going to be perfect and clean. The other thing that's really great, and if you remember back from Photographing the World 2, Cityscapes, when I was shooting at the Church of the Good Shepherd, there were so many people out here with flashlights, doing selfies, with headlamps. I had to protect the camera and make sure there was no light that would ever enter the front and destroy my sequence. But here, this is a canyon. There is nobody down there. Nobody could possibly get in front of me, and nobody could possibly disrupt the sequence. So I think it's going to be clean from start to finish. When we got out here early, there were so many people. There were hundreds of people capturing the sunset. But after that sun went down, people just started disappearing. And throughout the night here, as it's gotten later and later, there's some people camping over here and enjoying it. But other than that, we're pretty much the only people here. It's amazing, actually. This place is great. I recommend anybody who watches this, come here and shoot it and stay past sunset, and you have it all to yourself. I'm sure if you come here in sunrise too, you'd have it that way, but it just goes to show you that these places empty out when you go at the right times. And even though it was busy, we still managed to get everything that we needed. Nobody really bothered us, because this wraps around, this canyon is so vast that you can set up almost anywhere. So it was really fun, actually. No coyotes attacked us. There were no crazy possums like there were in New Zealand. And I think we captured a bunch of great images, and I have a good feeling that this vertical panorama idea is going to work out beautifully. When it first got dark out here, it was pitch black. We had to set up all of our headlamps and lights just to make sure that we could walk around out here. But when that moon came up, it was like a sunrise. We could see everything that we were doing, and we started to get this beautiful crawl of light down Horseshoe Bend itself. It was amazing. It was just like a second sunrise. And it was interesting because the moon rose just where the sun typically rises. So we watched that light creep down Horseshoe Bend, and it was a beautiful experience to be able to see this landscape painted in moonlight and moon shadows. Well, guys, I have to admit, I'm excited about this shot because I think it's a new and creative way to use a tilt shift lens, and I love astrophotography. We had the perfect conditions. So the next step is to take all of these images into post-processing, start blending them together, balancing the light, and of course, processing and combining the star trails. So the next time I see you guys, it's going to be back in the studio with less headlamps and of course, less light in my face. See you guys there. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. You just watched Horseshoe Bend and my attempt to do a shift vertical pano and capture enough stars to pull off a panoramic star trail image. So let's see if all of that hard work in the field pays off and let's see if this is actually possible to edit. We're going to begin in Lightroom. Now, this is my master Lightroom catalog, and it's going to look a lot different than the catalog that's going to come along with this tutorial, but I'll explain that as we go forward. But let's begin with the images for the pano itself. So this is the first panel. This is shifted all the way down, almost straight out of camera. All I did here, if I reset it, you can see that I just bumped the exposure just a little bit. In the middle here, I tried to match the exposure. I actually brought the highlights down, the shadows up, and the exposure up a little bit because straight out of camera, you could see it was a little dark. In addition, there is another little gradient here, and you can see that that's pulling the whites down even more. So it's pretty straightforward, and what I'm actually trying to do is look at the tones here, and for the most part match it, get it to be within, I'd say, 10 to 15% accurate so that it'll stitch together properly. Here's the panel for the sky and the top of Horseshoe Bend here. You can see that I adjusted it. I had to go pretty extreme here. I had to pull the highlights down to 100, up in the shadows plus 100, and down on the whites 25. Because you can see if I reset this, that was pretty much blown out because I'm exposing for those highlights. So thankfully I was able to bring that back. If I select all three of these, after I make the edits, go up to Photo, Photo Merge, Panorama. Once the panorama builds, I also want to point out that I'm using perspective. Now, cylindrical and spherical are going to be very similar, but you can see perspective is based on the idea that there is no distortion. Now, there's no parallax. I didn't have to find the zero fixed nodal point. I didn't have to find any of that because using a shift lens or a tilt shift lens and doing a shift pano means that the interior element of the lens actually moves independently as the front part stays still. So it creates a perfect shift. So theoretically, inside of Photoshop, I could also take these and just layer them and blend them together manually. So when I tell it to use perspective, it's also doing that. It's basically just layering these things on top of each other. And you can see that it's basically just shifted or offset these a few pixels here on the left. You can see that white, which is a little strange, but it is putting it together as accurately as possible. Last thing, I'm not using the boundary warp because that's actually going to distort some of my edges. Remember, we're going to use this as a foundation, and then afterwards we're going to bring those star layers in. When I apply or click merge, I end up with this result. Now, it's important to understand that Lightroom takes raw files, and when you put those raw files through as a pano, when it creates that pano image, it also creates a raw file, but it creates a DNG. And what it also does is it tries to bring those corrections above or through to the panoramic image that it creates. So in this case, it's taken some of my settings and it's put it through. The exposure, the shadows, the whites, and it's even copied this gradient, though it made some changes. So it tries to match it because it wants to leave some of the edits in the resulting raw file. So far that actually looks pretty good. It's a great foundation to work with. So let's go ahead and export this into Photoshop. We're going to do that first. Just say export. I'm going to make sure that my settings are okay. Set to temp and PSD, ProPhoto RGB 16 bits, and then open in Photoshop CC. And I'm just going to say export, and I'll use unique names because I was working on this earlier. Perfect. Now this is in Photoshop. Now that we have this foundation, let's start talking about the stars. We're going to go back to Lightroom. When you're shooting star trails, capturing 200 to 250 is a total win. Now what's interesting about this, check out the early one here, and if I go all the way to the end, check out the late one here. If we go to the beginning, notice how that sky is much darker. Well, why is that? It's actually because we had a moonrise. So the moon, thankfully, was rising behind me, but it also started to illuminate some of the landscape, and you can see that here. If I go back to the beginning, it's really dark. So what we're going to get as we start to stack these together is the light accumulation on the sky, so it's going to become more blue, and all that blue is going to come through, especially on the bottom here on the horizon, and also that light accumulation on the landscape itself, which is actually going to make blending much easier. Now, I did check the moon phase and where the moon was rising, so I knew it was coming up behind, but I wasn't sure how it was going to affect the compositing of this image in general. So it's going to be interesting when we bring this into Photoshop. Do we see if that moonlight actually helps us blend this with the layer below? But I also did some additional adjustment, and I want to show you guys exactly what I did. So here, the original just because there is a glow on the horizon, if I take a look at this and delete it, you can see that it goes from light to dark. So I didn't want this accumulation of a glow on the horizon. If I have a gradation of light to dark, I want to be able to generate it on my own. So what I did is I actually just created a soft gradient mask here, and if I show it, it's just selecting the top of the sky, and I just did an exposure of +1, shadows 50, and whites 25. And that was basically, if I delete it one more time, you see the before and after, that was to get rid of this gradation that I got in camera. We might add some darkening to the top of the sky later, but until then, I want to have it be as clean as possible. Now, the fun part. What I actually do is I take all of these, and I'll go right up until that point where the green goes away. Here, Shift, and it should say 250 selected. And let's talk about how I'm exporting these. So right-click, Export. I'm not going to say Export with Previous. I'm going to go Export. Now in this case, I'm actually going to choose a different folder, or in this case, I can say put in subfolder, and I can say stars from Horseshoe Bend. We'll say exactly what it is, so 250. And I'm going to put in parentheses TIFF, just so I know that, because we're going to go down here and we're going to change this mode to TIFF. Now, I've recently updated to the brand new 2018 MacBook Pro. It's really good at handling TIFFs, as opposed to JPEGs. Now, if you're not going to do any additional editing on these stars, you can export as JPEG, and if your computer is really slow, you're working on an older MacBook or an older PC, you can get away with exporting JPEGs. But now that I've upgraded and everything's getting a lot more powerful with solid state, I can use TIFFs, and I can also use ProPhoto RGB. But here's the thing. I don't need to use 16 bits. I can get away with 8-bit because I'm not going to be pushing these that far. And this is going to half the size of that TIFF file, which is going to be tremendous when we're bringing this into Photoshop. Resolution stays native, include all the metadata, and I'm not going to open it. This is really important. When you export these, if you're doing my process of constantly going to a temp and having it automatically open up in Photoshop, the last thing you want to do is export 250 layers and have them automatically open up in Photoshop. It's a nightmare. You have to close Photoshop, and it's no fun. So trust me on that. Make sure to say do nothing and say export. So I've already done this, so I'm just going to say cancel because they're already set. All right, so before we head into Photoshop and start talking about how to stack these stars and fade them so they look like little comets throughout the sky, let's talk about what's included in the lesson files portion of this. When you download this tutorial, you will actually have these 3 panels for the panoramic image, and then I'm actually going to give you guys the flattened versions of what we're going to be working on next. In addition, I'm going to be including a folder that has 25 star JPEGs so we can run through the next process together. So let's go ahead and do that. Go into Photoshop here. Now, if you're new to Photographing the World, this might be new information. If you guys have followed along since Photographing the World 1, 2, and 3, this will be a bit of a review, but it's always good to take a look at this. And if you haven't done astrophotography in some time, sometimes it's easy to forget. So the first thing we need to do is bring all of these images in as a stack. Now, as an example, we're going to start with 25 images so we can work the kinks out. Process is go up to File, Scripts, Load files into stack. At that point, you browse to the folder that you created, and I'm going to pick the 25 star images for demonstration here. Select them all, and again, these are TIFFs. You guys will have JPEGs, and I'm going to say Open. And you don't have to automatically align them, and in fact, you hope you don't. Everything should have been shot consistently, and aligning them, if everything is already in alignment, actually can misalign them, if that makes sense. So don't click this, and also don't create a smart object. We don't need to make a smart object out of this, and say OK. Now obviously 25 takes much less time than 250. That was actually quite quick. So now I have 25 layers here. And you know what? Just to make this a little bit easier for demonstration, let's go ahead and break out this panel. And let's just move this layers panel out by itself so we can have more screen real estate here. We'll just go ahead and slide that down. So I can basically see all 25. So right now, in order to create star trails, once this is all inside of a single PSD, you simply have to select them all, go up here, and use the lighten blending mode. Now remember, lighten's very cool because lighten basically says anything that's 50% gray and below, 50% gray to black, is going to be disappeared. and everything that is basically 50% gray or 51 to white is going to show through. In other words, all of these little star trails and some of the light accumulation here. Even with 25 stars, this is already looking pretty cool. Now, if I start to turn these off, you can see that the top layers here represent the top part of the sky. Now, here's a really interesting thing. Let's say we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of these. And we'll go ahead and turn off the other 15. If I wanted to create a tail fade, let's go ahead and zoom in on this too. It would be easy because all I'd have to do is say, starting with this one, which is going to be the bottom. Always identify bottom or top. You can decide if you want your star trails to shoot up in the sky or down. It's a total style choice. So we're going to leave this at 100%. We're going to change this to 90. The hotkeys for changing opacity are simply pressing the corresponding number on the keypad. So in this case, 9 being 90, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And now you can see with 10, very easy to create these little comets in the sky. So if you've only shot 10 or 20, you can still create something that's fairly unique and interesting. But we're going to take it a step further. Usually I'm working with uneven numbers. So we're going to go ahead and turn these back by hitting 0 for 100. And now we have 25. So the reason that I'm giving you guys 25 is it's expandable to 250. So we're going to do it with 25. I'm actually going to do it with 250, but the process is this. So I want to create an even fade. So fully opaque here on the bottom, and then less and less and less and less all the way to small opacity, or 10% in this case here. So what I'm actually going to do is take the first 5 here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're going to leave these fully opaque. And what I usually do in this case is I'll right-click and change the color so I know these are going to stay. Now I have 20. So when I had 10 before, it was 100, 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. So in this case, it's going to be 2 that are going to stay actually at 100, and then 2 that are going to be 90, 2 that are going to be 80, 2 that are going to be 70, 2 that are going to be 60. Can you guess what comes next? Yep, 50, 40, 30, 20, and 10. So now we have a thicker sort of front on this, or more opaque, bold front, but as I zoom out, you can see it still looks consistent because it basically just starts that fade a little bit later. So now what I'm actually going to have to do, and we'll go ahead and start opening up that file, is now I'm going to actually have to do this to 250 layers. So 25 was pretty fast, but obviously 250 is going to be a little bit different. Let me go ahead and open up that file. I've already put it together just so you guys can see exactly what it looks like. And here we go. Here is the PSB, it's a large format Photoshop document with 250 TIFF layers. I have to say we sped through it, but this took quite a bit of time to load because it's about a 30 gig file, which is pretty massive by Photoshop standards. And if I scroll down, you can see there are tons of these TIFFs. And what I've actually done is gone through, and instead, when we had the 25, I started with 5 images. This time, I actually highlighted and selected the first 50. So the first 50 are going to stay at 100%, and then the next 2 are going to stay as well at 100%. But instead of going to 90, the next 2 are going to go to 99, then it's going to go to 98, and then it's going to go to 97, all the way down to 1% opacity. So obviously this is going to take a little bit more time. I estimate maybe 10 minutes to get it all wrapped up. Let's see how long it takes me. Well, to be fair, that actually didn't take me that long. And here's the final result. I went ahead and did a couple different versions, flattened them out, and this is actually what I'm going to include for you guys to be able to mess with so you can decide. Now, the first thing I want to cover is this is star stacked, no fade. So you can see this is everything. This is 250 stars. That's how far they streak across the sky. And you can see that we're starting to get the bend towards north and south here because we're actually shooting almost at the meridian, which is pretty cool. We also have a lot of stuff going on. And if I zoom in on this, this is where you really feel like you're not out in the nature anymore because there's some airplanes zooming by here. You can see this red light flashing on this airplane. We also have a lot of just strange light ones all the way down here. So see all of these streaks, these little dots. All of that, unfortunately, is going to need to be cleaned up. Now, it will look nice when it's done and truly polished, especially if you're going to print this really large. And remember, this is a 3-panel pano, so it's going to be a massive final image at native 300 dpi. The next thing, though, is we went ahead and did the fade, the 250 fade. So you can see that's what that looks like. Now, it does look like the stars kind of disappear because, well, they do. But we also get nice, soft effects. So these really hot stars here start to look less hot. I prefer this to the standard linear look of the stars being the same opacity from the start to the beginning. I prefer them to fade in a linear fashion. But what if you didn't shoot 250? What if you were only able to shoot 100 because your battery died or you only had enough time or there were clouds that came in? Well, this is what it looks like faded with 100. I went ahead and created one additional one so you can see what 100 stars looks like. And I still think that 100 stars looks really nice. Obviously, it's not as intense or dramatic as all the stars in the sky, or certainly not as dramatic as all of them without the fade, but it's still very possible. One last thing to point out too is by fading them, sometimes we can get rid of some of those problems in the sky. So obviously this line here is a little less intense. Some of those little dots disappear, but for the most part, the next step is actually going to be cleaning this up. So I kind of want to address this situation. Now, obviously, if you were going to post this to Instagram or something low resolution, you probably don't have to spend that much time on it. Now, star trails take longer than traditional astrophotography because we're not just talking about a single shot of the Milky Way, noise reduction, and some contrast adjustments and things like that. We're actually talking about the light accumulation. In this case, it's going to take a while to blend this. I already foresee some issues with the color and the lighting and blending this into the environment seamlessly. So, in my opinion, if you're going to already do this, do it right the first time. Don't do it sort of halfway the first time. Don't spend a single hour on it because you're just going to have to go back and do it again later. So let's talk about how to actually do this. How do we get rid of these lines? Well, thankfully, throughout the years, Photoshop has been greatly improving on its content-aware features. So a lot of times we can just get rid of this stuff with a simple click. And I just want to show you guys exactly what I mean. Don't want to zoom that far in. That is not what I was trying to do. But a lot of these little dots down here, let's find a really good example of some of this, sort of these little dots, like these kind of things around here. See these dots? We can easily get rid of some of this just using the heel brush. And you can see that I can change the size of this brush here and just make it really small. It's going to be really easy to just go in and zap some of these things out, just like this. Now, obviously, that's incredibly time consuming, but the larger ones that are sort of out in the middle of nowhere, like these here, that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go in and kind of zap these out. Are they that noticeable? No, not really, but they are to me. With the astrophotography, I really like the star trails to be as clean as possible. And in this case, I don't know if these are planes. Sometimes light can hit, well, anything, bats, moths, birds, all sorts of things. Of course, there can be aliens, UFOs, all that other stuff, because we are getting close to New Mexico here out in Arizona, so you never know the kind of stuff that's actually going on in space. But I want to show you something that has been improving drastically inside of Photoshop. And I want to show you every way that we're actually going to go and do this together. But let's say you have a bunch of continuous or parallel lines. If we were to actually use this tool, the heel brush, and brush across this, sometimes Photoshop can identify that all of these parallel lines that are actually feeding through the composition are what you're trying to keep. And when you isolate your selection just to the area of this, something just like this, sometimes it does a good job by filling in everything. And you can see that it's actually done a really nice job. So in some of these cases, I'm actually going to be able to go through and just paint this across, just across. And Photoshop will figure out that these dots are the inconsistency, and it should just fill in and make it more consistent. If that fails me, for example, let's try this one here. Let's try this line, and I'll thicken that up to try to get both of them, just like this. We'll see what happens. Works pretty well. Now, take a look at this little wobble here. I'm going to go ahead and undo it. You can see that little wobble in the stars, that wobble. That can look bad. Also this. So anytime that happens, what I'll actually do is switch to the clone stamp. And obviously a smaller one, I use a flow of probably 20 or 30%. We'll zoom in a little bit more. Now this is the manual way of doing it. I know a lot of you guys don't like doing this, but if things aren't working out, it's always good to be able to do it the manual way. And what we're actually going to do is select a high point of contrast, and that's really easy. So let's say a little bit above here, the center of this star, and then we're going to move down and actually just manually place that over top. And what's cool, once that's done, since it's all parallel lines, we can actually just go ahead and paint it in, just like that. And it looks pretty good. Now, it will start to wobble on certain edges, so you have to be careful to basically, and I'll show you why. It'll start to wobble on edges because these lines aren't exactly straight, and some of them are not exactly consistent. So in those cases, you actually have to pick up again and start over. So what we'll do here, for example, start here, make sure that that's as straight as possible. Don't go too far off of the star itself, and then we can actually just kind of paint them out here until it starts to get off. As soon as it starts to get off, you basically just pick it up again, just like that. And we have to do that with every single bit of this image. But rather than bore you guys with me talking over this entire process and trying to entertain both myself and you, we're just going to fast forward through the process. We'll keep a little timer on the bottom of the screen to figure out how much time this is going to take me. I estimate maybe 45 minutes to an hour. So let's see. And there we go. Thank goodness. Actually, my hand was starting to cramp up, even using the stylus here. What we have now is a clean version. 250 stars stacked, faded, and clean. So that looks pretty good. Now it's time to get this into here. So let's do that their favorite way. Select all, Command A, copy, Command C. And I'm not going to close it this time. I'm just going to deselect with Command D. And we're going to paste this in. And you can see that that's dramatically different. Previously, in other lessons, we have done things using the alignment, the Align Layers tool, but it's not going to work because it has a bunch of stars and no geometry. So what we're going to do is do this the old-fashioned way. Now I'm just going to go ahead and move this up, and you can see I have Snap enabled, and if you go under View, you can see Snap. And it's basically just going to snap in any layers or any edges. So we'll go ahead and sort of snap that to the top image. It's going to be close, and I'm going to zoom in here. Now, first thing, this top part is completely different. The white balance is completely different. The moonlight's completely different. It's a little bit more dull because we're not getting that backlight. So could we have done something to prevent or mitigate this from Lightroom? Yes, of course. If we went back to the Lightroom catalog, there is a chance that I could have gone in here and tried to match it here. But you can see the difference, the discrepancy of those colors. So if I actually scroll back over to the top image here, and we just go back and forth, you can see that that's really nice warm tones, and this is, I don't even know, it's not even cold tones, it's kind of brown. The other thing is the light accumulation is going to change. So we could have gone in here and tried to color correct that to match, but either way, it wouldn't have been the same. It would have been closer, but I like to do it this way because if we did it, if we kept trying it, we could either try it on one layer, one of those star layers individually, or if I wanted to change it at this point, I'd have to go back, re-export everything, restack everything, re-clean everything, and I really don't feel like doing that. So we're just going to go ahead and do it inside of Photoshop and fix it. The first thing is we have to decide, is this aligned? And right now it's not. So there's a couple ways to do this. My favorite way is actually using the difference blending mode, a blending mode that you would never use for anything else. With difference, we can actually see the difference of the edges, and I can actually just start arrow key changing this. And as I go down, 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 you can see those edges are starting to come into alignment, and it looks pretty good. It looks like I need to go 1 pixel to the right, 2 pixels to the right, 1 down. If I go up, we can see we make sure all of those lines are going to be intact all the way to the edge, like this one right here. Down, 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 and down, down, just like this. That looks pretty good. So we'll go back to normal. toggle that? The lighting's going to change, but what I'm most critical of is the position itself. As long as that position doesn't change, the geometry is the same, but you can see that the lighting changes again. Let's go right back into that difference mode and make sure that this is perfect. I really want to zoom this in here and really see. So if I go up 1, that's pretty good. You see that halo that we're starting to get. So make sure that's just on there perfectly. I think that's perfect. Let's go ahead and zoom that back. We'll go ahead and take that psychedelic blending mode off, back to normal. And now let's really talk about this. So right now we have a scene that doesn't really match entirely. So what we're going to need to do is color correct this. I'm going to do that with a curves layer. Make new layer here, curves. And if I do curves now, it's going to do everything. I don't want that. I want it to just apply to the stars. We're going to go ahead and link that. And we're going to zoom in a little bit here. And we're going to match the color. First thing, it's a little dark. So let's go ahead and bring the gamma up to try to match. So we stop seeing that edge. Stop basically seeing that edge right there. Now let's go ahead and adjust the colors. So I'm going to go into the reds here and pull the red up just a little bit just to match that. And I can add a little bit of that sort of cool tone by adding blue into it, matching it. That's getting pretty close. May even want to follow up with green. I can add just a little bit of green, and that's going to remove the red, or I can pull it back and add more red. So I think just between blue and red. So let's go back to the RGB. I'm going to bring this up just a little bit more just to match it. It's looking pretty good. You can almost see that edge matching perfectly. We'll go back to the red channel. And I can select this dot and actually use the arrow keys, so just basically making micro adjustments to this. And we'll go back to the blue, another little micro adjustment here, pulling that up just to get it to be about perfect. All right, so now if I zoom this back a little bit, we can see that the color is close. So now I'll go ahead and create a mask on this layer, and we're going to name this first. We'll call this background pano. We'll call this stars stacked and faded. And we'll call this color shift match, because we shifted and matched. Now here, I'm also going to save this in the background while I'm working, and we'll go ahead and create a mask. I'll zoom in here, and what I simply want to do is figure out what the end of this mask is going to be in the beginning. So it's going to be visible from here to here. So I'm going to switch this to black, and I'm going to click on the bottom of this layer here, and I'm going to drag up all the way to the sky, right about here. And you can see that that's going to disappear. So now what we've been able to do is just blend that right into the environment. Now obviously the lighting changed. That's not that big of a deal because the geometry is the same. And it's a soft gradation. If I turn this on and off, you can see it's a soft gradation. And we actually get more details in the background because of the moonlight. So this is really flat and backlit, but when I add this, I actually get more detail. So it's actually a bonus in this case. But I'm also picking up more of the dark here. So see how dark these edges are already? When I add this on top, I'm getting more of that. So in addition, what we need to do is we need to go in and paint some of this out using a low flow. So we're just going to go ahead and paint some of that dark out. I want to be careful not to paint some of this out, so I have to be really careful here to just manage this part of the rock. Pretty easy to do. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect because we're essentially, even though the lighting changed just a little bit, blending this into itself. And that rock was already a little bit dark, so we'll go ahead and get rid of most of it here. We'll go in a little bit more, fine-tune our brush size, make sure it's fully soft, because I really just want to take care to feather those edges into this. Really get into that here. Getting rid of that. I'll just go ahead and fade up. Now by doing this, getting really close to this edge, I'm also going to lose some of the detail that I did get or regain in that background, but we have to be really, really careful about this. So we want to keep it as close as possible. And a little bit of blue in that background's fine, and we take a look at it on and off. Not bad. Get rid of a little bit more here. It's looking pretty good. Let's just turn it off and on. These are the steps that we really have to get right before we move on and start baking all this down to a single layer for additional adjustment. We want to make sure that this is as clean and as seamless as possible. Anything here that you want to get rid of too, nobody's really going to notice, but you can see there's more detail. If we do get rid of this, it can tend to have a little bit more sharper detail. So remember, this foreground was shot at f8 and with everything intact, which is really nice, so super sharp. And the background, the stars, were shot with a higher ISO, and so obviously those are not going to have the same quality. You can see it's a little softer in the background. Then again, this foreground was severely backlit, so we may regain some detail. But this is just a little bit of a balancing act, just to get it to look as natural and sharp as possible. And if we back that up, it's looking much better from start to finish. Just need to clean this up just a little bit more. Bear with me as I get this as close to accurate, as close to accurate as we can with a light brush. So we'll just pull those edges up. This is fine. And I'll just mitigate that blue that I got. Perfect. And we can go ahead and adjust those shadows a little bit more later, but this is looking good so far. Before we move on to the next step, let's address the cropping. So you can see when this panel was stitched, it offset a little bit. And also, if I actually hold zoom or command getting ready to zoom out, you can see that this star layer actually extends past the composition. So I don't want to lose any of those stars. So let's go to the crop tool, and I'm going to clear it just so we don't get any options here. And I'm basically just going to bring that to the top. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and since snap is enabled, it's actually going to just snap that right to the edge of this on this side. And this side as well, it's going to probably just snap it right to the edge. And then on the top, I don't know if snap's going to work, but we just want to make sure that we get everything in there, or as much as possible. We'll zoom out, and again, I always leave delete cropped pixels off just in case I need to go back and make a change. But right now, this is going to look a little bit better and much less distracting. So that looks pretty good. If I zoom in, there's something going on up here that we'll have to address later. It looks like there's a 1 pixel edge. Otherwise, pretty good. Now what's really nice too is if we turn this off, you can see that there's no way we could have blended this without that layer. But look how dark the stars look. When I actually added that color correction, I color corrected it to its environment. So by matching the tones of the rock, I also matched the luminosity of the sky. So now the sky and the foreground work much better together than they did before. So that's definitely an added perk. So the next step is to actually remove some of the distracting objects. And in this case, there aren't too many distracting objects, but there are some lights and some different things up here to take care of. Since we have adjustments, let's go ahead and use Shift, Option, Command, E to create a new layer. So we call this blended and cleaned result. And the reason is, I'm going to go ahead back to the content aware brush, zoom in, and let's get rid of those lights. I don't like all that going on there. Doesn't look that great. Perfect. And let's find other distracting elements. If I actually zoom in here, this is so high res that we can see that there is a little bit of a camping party going on over here. I'm going to leave those guys down there because that's kind of cool. There's something here, guy fishing, something's going on. But what I want to address here is the bottom of the image. Now I was trying to get this away from the ledge, but I kind of like these rocks here. I don't like how this is so distracting, so I'm actually going to get rid of this rock. And we're going to throw a Hail Mary pass. For those of you guys who are not familiar with American football, that's basically tossing the ball as far as you can and hoping somebody catches it and scores a goal. So that's kind of like what I'm doing, a Hail Mary pass. Can Content Aware take care of this problem for me? Yeah, actually not too bad, but not too great. But it's a starting point. So let's use the clone stamp and let's clean that up a little bit. So I'm using a flow of 20%. I'm just going to add some more grass in those little dull areas there. Not a big deal. Or a little bit more grass here, a little bit more colorful grass. Just kind of let that go in. Same thing out here. Why not? We'll just give it some more texture. Some more texture. None of this is crucial out here. It's really just color and texture. I want to make sure that nothing looks like it's cloned. Actually, what I just did was made it look like it was a repeating pattern. So let's just kind of get rid of some of that, get rid of some of this, clean up these ridges, give it a little bit more of the grassy texture here, and a little bit of before and after. And that's convincing enough for me. It looks good. So as a base blend, this looks great. But if we look at the histogram, we can see that, well, it's a little dark And if we just look at it visually, we can see that it's also a little bit dark. So we need to start unifying these values. We're going to use an Adobe Camera Raw filter to pull all this back into a more harmonious spectrum, a little bit more bright, and hopefully looking a little bit more unified. So let's duplicate this, name this one ACRF, and I'll just call this global, and I'll explain that in a moment. So let's go up here and say filter, Camera Raw filter. Let's just go ahead and bring the exposure up. So half a stop. And we'll compensate by bringing the highlights down a little bit. And let's also pull up some contrast. I like the idea of some deep contrast on this one. To pull up that contrast a little bit. Let's also add a little bit of dehaze, maybe 10, and a little bit of vibrance just to pull some of the color saturation up. And we're going to go with that. So we have something. So this is going to be the default, the starting point that we're going to work with. What really concerns me about this image, though, are these areas. So see here, see that really dark reflection? It's kind of cool. Like we're actually getting a reflection from this mountain. Here, there's a reflection of the mountain. Down here in the water, you can kind of start to see some greens and some nice tones, but it's just way too dark. So I want to be able to adjust those shadows. But if I pull the shadows up here, you can see I start to reveal all that, but I lose all the contrast that I added. In a similar fashion, I could try to brush or elliptical selection just this area, but if I did so, let's say here, and I even rotated it, if I reset this correctly and I pull the shadows up, it's also going to pull the shadows up around it, so this area. So I try to tighten that down. So I'm going to address this a more precise way. So let's go ahead and get rid of this, and we'll go back to the global tools, make sure that's all set the way that we want it, and apply it. Let's do this a different way. Let's duplicate this, and I'll call this ACRF Shadow Boost. Go back up to Camera Raw filter. Let's go over here and pull those shadows all the way up. Let's increase the blacks to about 20. So that's going to look pretty washed out. Can't use it by itself, but let's go ahead and apply it. Now the cool thing is, after I apply this, I have my global adjustment and then I have my shadow boost adjustment. So what I want to do is use a luminosity mask to be able to isolate this correction. So I'm going to turn this off first because I want to use the contrasty bit. Now we've done this before, we've used luminosity masks, but let's go ahead and create another one together. So I'm going to command click RGB, the RGB channel, and create new mask. I'm going to deselect and we're going to take a look at it. Right now we have the highlights selected, which looks pretty good for the highlights. I'm going to invert it with Command I, and I'm going to call this Shadows 1. Now what I could do is I could do Command M for curves, and I could try to isolate these shadows a little bit more. Well, that's one way to do it, but we can also intersect the mask to create different levels of shadows. Let me walk you through how that works. If I load this as a selection holding Command click, I can also subtract things with Command Option or add things with Command Shift. It's actually really interesting. If we were to take a blank alpha channel and I were to create a mask here, so let's just say a big square, and I know this is kind of boring, a big square, but just bear with me for a second. If I were to create a second one, and let's say that I create an ellipse instead. So we create an ellipse through the image like this, and I'll hold spacebar to move it, and we'll just go ahead and create two masks like this. So I basically have this one and this one. Well, let's create a new one here, a blank one. If I were to Command click Alpha 1, you can see that the square loads. If I were to Command Shift Alpha 2, I can add this selection to itself, which is kind of cool. So let me go ahead and deselect. I can also say load the square and subtract the circle, so you can see that I can actually create compound masks, which is pretty cool. What I can also do, which I really like using sometimes, is I can actually load one, and by holding Command Option Shift, I get a little X, and it's going to intersect itself. So I can actually intersect it and get the results of those, the intersection of both. So why is this important? Well, it's the fundamental philosophy behind being able to create steps in luminosity masking. So while we can use curves, and I use curves all the time, this is one way that you can do it, we also get some destruction around the edges. When we use the intersect method, we actually retain, for the most part, the anti-aliasing as well, so those soft areas around pixels. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and select and load it. But now, with it loaded, let's intersect it. So remember, Command Option, Shift. Intersect it with itself. Now let's create a new mask. We'll take a look. It's a little bit darker. What happens if we intersect it again? Create another mask. A little bit darker. Let's create another one. Here, let's create one more. And create the mask. Perfect. So we have Shadows 1. Let's go ahead and start naming these. I'll deselect. We'll call this Shadows 2. Shadows 3. Shadows 4. Shadows 5. So this gets really dramatic. Now, Shadows 1, the intersection for Shadows 2, you can see that it's basically clamping it down a little bit into Shadows 3 and Shadows 4, and then really extreme Shadows 5. I mean, these are just the darkest parts, and you can actually see it here on the histogram all the way on the left, a little bit more over, more in the mid-tone, and all the way across. So we're actually able to isolate these as selections. Now that they're channels, we can use them as selections. I should point out that there are countless plugins and panels and all sorts of things that you can buy or purchase or download that will create these for you. It'll create a million of these things for you that you don't need. It's also extremely easy to create them yourself, to create an action that creates them for you. So I want to stick to the theme of being able to create everything on our own without using third-party plugins, because you can always create a luminosity mask. You can always create an intersected luminosity mask on your own. The problem with plugins and panels in general is we don't know what happens when Photoshop's updated. Sometimes they're incompatible. Sometimes the person who creates them does not update them, and we can have problems with that. So I just want to be able to create these things manually together. But if you get the hang of it, feel free to use whatever panel you want. The end result should be the same. And essentially for this, what we're actually going to do is use Shadows 3. Selecting it, command-clicking it, going back to the layers, and what I'm actually going to do is create a folder, and we're going to call this Shadows 3. I know that's not very original, but we're going to go ahead and put this inside here. So now, right off the bat, instead of being a total overlay of the image, we're actually only contained inside of this as an alpha channel. So anything that's white is going to show our shadow adjustment. Anything that's black is going to exclude it. And you can see that happening here. So it looks pretty good. If I disable this mask, you can see what happens to the entire image. So what I'm actually going to do is selectively add parts of this back in. So with this as the master mask, this is now nested inside of here, so I can actually hold Option, click a new mask, and create a black mask. Then I can follow up by zooming in on the areas that I really want to work on with the brush tool and a lower flow of maybe 20 or 30. I can actually go in and start revealing. You can see I can reveal these areas, which are really nice, without affecting the surrounding areas. So basically everywhere in this image that I have shadows that I want to reveal, or in this case this reflection, I can just start to paint those in softly while not affecting the rest of it. So all this detail, watch how quickly I can get that back. Really nice. Quickly get that back. Some of this down here, just a little bit of that detail. And if we zoom this back a little bit, what I really want to do too is address some of this. I don't want the bottom of the image, but I also want to be able to incorporate some of the river. The river itself, to me, should be a little bit brighter throughout. So by doing this, I can adjust the shadows without having to do a complex selection. Since the luminosity mask does the bulk of the work for me, and then my color correction inside of here, the Adobe Camera Raw layer that we did, basically takes care of everything else. And if I turn this on and off, you can see that we're able to now just address the areas that we want to. And it can go further into some areas here if you think some areas are a little bit dark. If you want to come up here and try to clean some of this up, feel free and do that as well. And then here we can actually start to add some of this highlight back, almost like we're using a dodge and burn layer. We can actually go through and start to pull some of these shadow areas out to create a little bit more of dynamic detail and some contrast here, which starts to look pretty nice. Now let's take it a step further. So we've already created the Shadows 3 layer. Let's go back to our channels. Let's take a look at what we created here. Shadows 1 is really interesting. So let's say that I wanted to, and as I expressed when we were in Lightroom together, I wanted to create a nice gradation of light to dark in the sky. So I wanted to recreate that effect that I mitigated inside of Lightroom. Well, I wouldn't want to just create a curves here because I don't want to darken the stars. I'm really only concerned about the blue. The stars should really be vivid and bright because, well, they're stars and they're super bright in the sky. So what I'm going to do is actually use one of these masks that we've already created. And in this case, you can see Shadows 2 is not going to work, but Shadows 1 basically has most of the sky selected. You can see it's a little gray here, so it's not going to be fully selected, but most importantly, it's knocking out the stars. The stars are black, they're blacked out, they're not going to be affected. So let's load this one, Command click, go back here, create a new folder, apply this to it, and we're going to call it Shadows 1. With Shadows 1 selected, let's go here and create a curves layer. And we're going to call this Darken Sky, because we are basically just going to pull this down until we get that nice rich blue color that we want. We can also change the intensity of that blue if we want to make it look a little bit softer. So if this is a little bit too saturated, we can actually come in and sort of pull this down here, because we're really only affecting that blue layer. And we can actually pull, and you'll see that that'll change the saturation point as well. Up here, really crisp and saturated. Down like this, less saturated, which is exactly what I want, right about here. So we're going to use a curve shift that looks like this. Then, you guessed it, we're going to grab the mask, hit G for the gradient tool, and it's going to start here, and it's going to end here. And you can see now we have a nice gradient, and it does not affect the stars at all. In fact, we can probably even do that a little bit more intensely to about here. You know what? I like the one before, so we're actually going to use the first one. I think that looks really good. So we have the Shadows 1 and the Shadows 2 affecting the image in a positive way. Since we've been working with the shadow channels, let's do some magic in the highlights too. We're going to go back to channels, and you can see that I have shadows. Let's go ahead and create a couple highlight layers too. Let's select RGB, Command click, create a new mask, and I'll call this Highlights. Highlights 1. Same thing with it loaded. We can intersect it, and that hotkey again, Command, Option, Shift, click, and we can create another one here. So this is going to be Highlights 2. Now Highlights 2 really just select the stars. You can see that the sky is pretty much omitted. Highlights 1, sky is about 50% selected. So if I were to do something here, bump this, I'd actually be affecting the sky. But here with Highlights 2, it's almost like a super highlight. So let's select that. Highlights 2, go back here, create another folder with a mask, and we'll call it Highlights 2. And here what I want to do is also create a curves layer. So what I've done here on the top of the sky already is I've gamma shifted or darkened the top of the sky. Now what I want to do is brighten those stars. And I can do that just by clamping them here. And you can see that that's going to get a little bit ridiculous. But as I start to do this, I'm looking at the top of it. I'm getting all of this light, which I don't want, but I'm just going to go ahead and clamp this really dramatically. And now using the gradient again, we're going to do the same thing that we did before from the top to the bottom, just like this. And now we're going to get more intensity from those stars. And from here, it's actually pretty cool because we can go between these. So we have the Shadows 1, which is the darkened sky, and we can actually pull that intensity or that darkness of those shadows down just a little bit, and we can actually pop the color of those stars and find the right balance between the color, the darkness, and then the lightness of the stars themselves. So let's go ahead and name this layer 2. We're going to call this Stars Brighten. Perfect. Here too, darkened sky, stars brighten, and that's starting to look pretty good. Let's zoom that out and take a look. It's looking really great, and it's all starting to come together, but let's go ahead and unify it even more. Now, we've already talked about shadows and highlights, but we haven't talked about midtones. So it's really interesting. If we look at the RGB spectrum here, I'm just going to go ahead and reset it so it shows accurately. A little spike, things that are blown out. The stars, obviously. Everything else is a little bit dark. Most of it's in the shadows. We have some midtones. So what I really want to do is increase the midtones. I want to take some of this and just shift it over to the right so the whole thing seems a little bit brighter. And I'm going to do that using a midtone mask. Midtone masks are fun. So we have shadows and highlights. Shadows 1 and highlights 1. So what we can actually do is select everything, which is Command A. Select all. And we can subtract the shadows and subtract the highlights. Photoshop's going to say, what are you trying to do? It's not going to show any selection when it's only 50% visible, but we're going to go ahead and create a new mask And if I can scroll down here, you can see this alpha 1 is actually midtones. So now the midtones, and you can see how great that looks here. Not a lot going on actually, but what we've done is we've selected all of the highlights and all of the shadows, and what we're left with is something in the middle. So I can take this midtones, load it. It's going to tell me again that it can't show the crawling ants, which is fine. We'll go to layers, create a new folder, a new mask, and we'll call this midtones. I want to do a couple different things here. I'm going to load a curves first, and we're going to name this curves gamma boost. Gamma boost simply going to be a gamma boost. And you can see as I start to do this, it's going to brighten everything. Now watch this histogram. So again, it's going to keep resetting it to here, but when I actually do this, you can see that it is going to start to shift all that over to the right. If I go too far, you can see it's really starting to stretch that out, and it looks like crap. So we really don't want to do that. We just want to find a good amount. So I can bring some of the brightness up. Now, when you are post-processing anything, I just want to point out it's better to do it with a nice, monitor that's calibrated or somewhat calibrated. Most importantly, don't put a big light in your face. So I have one light and a giant softbox in my face. I'm going to do my best to make sure this looks good. That's why I'm getting a little closer to the monitor too, to try to block out some of that light. So here we're going to move the gamma up. Now this is going to create a more bright image. But while I'm adding brightness to this image, it's also taking away some of the contrast. So I'm going to create a second curves layer. And we're going to call this midtone contrast. So this is pretty fun. So here I can actually darken some of the midtones, and you can see that if I do that, it's not actually having the same effect as if I did a whole gamma boost, because we only have some of the image, the midtone area right around here selected. So what I can do is add deep contrast to the midtones and actually bump contrast in the highlights. So you can see as I do that, only this part of the midtone area, which is most of the image, is going to be affected. So all of those highlights are going to become more contrasty, and here all of the shadows are going to become more contrasty as well. So I can start to basically mitigate this layer underneath, or at least mitigate how it was washing everything out. And with a combination of both of these, I can balance and shift both the midtones, and I can actually shift and create some really nice tonal contrast. So this effect here that we're creating in the midtones replaces a lot of third-party plugins because it actually is creating micro contrast. It's not actually making the brights brighter and the darks darker evenly. It's actually maintaining the highlights and the shadows in place while doing micro adjustments to the tones in the middle, in this case the midtones, which make up most of the image. So it's really powerful. So it's a really quick way to add dynamic contrast to your images without relying on any third-party plugins. And between these two, we can start to get some life back in this image, just like that. I feel this is a pretty cool image, and it's honestly the first time I've ever tried to do this. I have never done a shift pano to incorporate astrophotography before. So this is really cool. So I encourage you guys to get out in the field and try this. And again, just like we do in the field, make sure everything's level. Make sure you think about everything. Overshoot a little bit. Shift down, shift middle, shift up. Make sure you have all three panels. And then for the astrophotography, just take all the steps necessary to make sure that you have a fresh battery. You get all the shots you need. Then in post, take your time to make sure everything lines up seamlessly. I think using a tilt shift lens is definitely the way to go here because there's zero parallax from the beginning. And we know that as long as we have everything set up in the camera correctly and we shift up, that these are going to stitch together perfectly every time. So I feel like we've done a lot on this image. Let's just go ahead and review together. We started with the background pano. We did some adjustments inside of Lightroom, so this isn't going to be a true before and after because this image was really dark before we stitched it together after the adjustments. But after that, we added the stars that we stacked together. We then color corrected the stars to match, for the most part, the environment we were putting them into. Then we blended and cleaned the result, which basically just means we got rid of this rock over here. Then we adjusted it globally using the Adobe Camera Raw filter. Then we tweaked the shadows with a combination of a luminosity mask and an Adobe Camera Raw filter. Then we additionally added some darkening to the sky there while maintaining the highlights using a shadows luminosity mask. We then shifted the highlights, intensified the highlights here, and then at the end we added some mid-tone contrast. And basically we went from before the pano to the astrophotography pano. So that wraps things up for this lesson. The first shift astrophotography pano star trails image we've done in photographing the world so far. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and next time I see you, we'll be back in the field.